The current session is going to be all about change organizations that work to improve learning of students today and their lives in the future. I am delighted to have a panel of exceptional leaders in the field of change making and organizational building. And I couldn't be happier at all for the opportunity to welcome these three fabulous women and friends to join us today for the summit. I'm going to start with Miranda Castrejon, who I think all of you know is the CEO of the California Charter Schools Association. It's the largest charter support organization in the United States, directly working with charter schools. And she comes to that role having been in many roles within the organization, but also having stepped out and stepped into leadership in more frontline change efforts. For several years, she was the founder and CEO of an organization in Los Angeles called Great Schools Now. And that was focused on transforming public education from the outside by supporting the development of high-quality seats, whether that meant district schools or charter schools. It was a concept of trying to improve wherever improvement could take root. And I'm going to be asking her questions today about how that worked, because I think there's some real insights that she gained from that experience that inform and color the work that she does now at CCSA. Prior to that, she was a longtime advocate, both in Los Angeles and before that in Texas. All the work has always focused on meeting the needs of students so that their learning could give them better life chances. I should also say that CCSA has been a strong partner of my research group, Credo, over the years, and I'm grateful for that partnership. While we maintain an independent perspective about studying charter schools, much of the work that we do could not occur if we didn't have the allyship and the opportunity for clarification and insight and context that our partnership with CCSA provides. So I'm grateful for that. She earned a BA from Andrews University and MA in doctoral studies in cultural anthropology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. Okay, guilty COVID pleasure. Are you ready? Building streaks of days wearing PJ bottoms. How many of us can relate to this? Oh yeah. Dressed on top, nobody sees anything else. Excellent. To her left, my right, is Romy Drucker, who is the director of K-12 Philanthropy for the Walton Family Foundation. She spent 3 years prior to that. I'm sorry, she was just elevated to that in the fall. And for 3 years prior to that, she was the deputy director. And so she has had an opportunity to learn the business before stepping in. Most of us, I think of Romy as the CEO and co-founder of the e-newsletter, The 74 Million, which was, I think, a really bold and genius stroke to try to place education news and news about education reform and improvement efforts front and center in American media today. She was innovative in format, she was innovative in delivery, she was innovative in focus. And she made a huge impact now when funders ask us, what impact did your work have? One of the questions they ask is, did you get picked up by the 74? Right? And I promise no cash has transferred hands. We let that happen the way it does. Prior to doing her work with the 74, however, she worked in the New York City Department of Education. You want to talk about front row view of policy and programs. I don't know if you've connected with other people who have had time in New York City DOE, but there are several of them here today. This is an amazing story of an organization trying to do important work immediately at tremendous scale. And so there's insights there in terms of what we can think about in terms of possibilities. She also, I think, has deep insight into the kinds of contact with leaders and how they think, how they move, how they are moved, that I think are going to be very interesting. And she's also uniquely positioned in the New York City context to talk about challenges and barriers, but also opportunities and successes. And I think the balance there in New York City is probably the most difficult that we can see in almost any setting in the US, so can't wait to hear about that. A BA in Literature and Spanish Language and Literature from Yale University, and she earned her Master's in Business Administration at Harvard University. Have to do the disclosure here. The Walton Family Foundation has been a long-time funder of Hoover and of Credo. And our work has been covered strictly and more impartially than I might have liked at the time by the 74. But we consider both organizations essential to our success, and we're grateful that she's here today. I didn't have a chance to ask you about your guilty COVID pleasure. What is it?
Driving. I'm one of those cliche New Yorkers that got a car during the pandemic and started driving. So that was my guilty pleasure.
Okay, that's unique. We haven't heard that one yet. That's great. All right. Finally, but certainly not least, is Russlynn Ali. She is the CEO and co-founder of the XQ Institute, an organization that's dedicated to rethinking the high school experience so that every child graduates ready to succeed in life. Concurrently, and for many years before that, she's been the managing director for education philanthropy at the Emerson Collective. And you may know that Emerson has an interesting organizational structure so that there's philanthropy and there's venture and there's a bit of activism as well. And having the opportunity to observe all of those and try to manage the intersections of those is something that Russlynn has built in as part of her toolkit. Prior to coming to Emerson, she was the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the US Department of Education in the Obama administration, and took the opportunity there to really place in motion a degree of transparency about what's happening with civil rights in schools through survey, through investigation, and through cases to pursue justice for kids. As if that was enough, it's not. She was the founding executive director of Ed Trust West, large focus in California, which we can talk about today, and was a vice president at Ed Trust National, based in DC. She has a BA from Spelman College, or was that just college and then American University?
I went to both for college before law school.
All right, there you
Spelman
go. And then a JD at Northwestern Pritzker School of Law. I've witnessed her leadership up close and personal. The final disclosure here. Emerson Collective has been a good supporter of Credo, but I've also had the chance to work alongside her in the XQ Institute work and seen the kind of vision and energy and push that she has brought to that effort. And the fact that she's still doing that after 7 years, given what a monstrously large job that is just a testament to her dedication to improving lives for kids. Delighted to have her here and to ask her what her guilty COVID pleasure was.
Chickens.
Could you say more?
I am now the mother of chickens.
But
And
not
I
a dog,
love
apparently.
them. Yes, dogs still.
Dogs and
And
chickens
I
get
picked
along?
up a cat along the way.
Oh.
But the chickens have taught me so much about life. Their names are Mavis and Babs, after my two deceased godmothers. So that's my guilty pleasure. They have a very nice home in the back of my home.
Isn't that great? Mm-hmm. Terrific. Okay, another unique answer. Well, let's get started. I think through the introductions, I've been able to demonstrate that we have collective wisdom and leadership on the stage that's just over the top. And the way that I want to start our conversation is to ask each of them to spend a few moments telling us about the seats that they've occupied. I've tried to give you an overview, what they've learned, and how that infuses the work that they're doing today. And so I'm going to ask Myrna if you'd start us off.
Wow. Well, I think the seminal experiences for me that have really ultimately guided and anchored my work in every single moment have it really come down to my experience as an immigrant. I came to the United States at 17, not speaking English fluently or actually at all. I could read it and write it, and I passed the TOEFL with 100%. But landed from northern Mexico in the frozen tundras of Michigan by myself, and had such a unique, wonderful, challenging, horrifying experience of finding my place and finding my voice through the college experience and trying to figure out whether and on what terms did I belong. So that narrative of belonging, place, creating those spaces where we can become, the people we are intended to be in our potential has been the driving force of my work in education. You mentioned I started, that I attempted a degree in anthropology at University of Wisconsin-Madison. That was very much about figuring out what made me different and what made me the same in the United States. And I soon went to the border in Texas and did 8 years of education organizing with the Industrial Areas Foundation, one of the most well-respected community organizing entities. And I discovered advocacy, and I really understood politics as the seeking of and apportionment of power, and who gets it and who doesn't, and how that impacts life choices. And I've never looked back. I was lucky enough to be on the starting team at CCSA in 2003 when Caprice Young started CCSA. And this year we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of public charter schools across the US. I know this is such an uncertain moment in so many ways for the future of education. We've been talking about it all day and the major implications. But I have an abiding faith in people, and our imaginative power, and the will of all of us to live to our higher purpose and to find real value in the struggle, no matter how hard it gets, to make sure that our systems work, especially for those who can least afford failure from the system, from their integration into public life, from their integration into the economy, so that we can be a more cohesive and more perfect union. The challenge for me, I think, then, coming in as the third CEO of CCSA in 2019, yeah, for those of you in California, you may recall that there was a massive backlash from our charter opponents in that legislative year, one that really called everything we knew about the collective power we had, our support, and what kind of attack could we withstand. And that has had massive repercussions for us and our movement in this great state since then. And so we've had to go back to the real fundamental basics. And I will shut up very soon here, but this particular 3 years when, 7 days into my tenure, we were surrounded by 17,000 striking teachers in red shirts, calling out our names and our mission as something that was anathema to democracy and public education. We've really had to go drill down to the basics of who are we, what are we here to prove, and on whose behalf and whose voice will need to be elevated. I'm really, really happy and pleased that in the intervening 2 years, the pandemic has given us an opportunity to prove yet again that while we are far from perfect, we've changed the arc and the trajectory of opportunity for more than 1 million students in our 30 years. That right now, in this moment, 750,000 students are benefiting from a public education and chartering that still offers greater flexibility, greater success, and a real opportunity to do things differently and to learn differently. And our schools went back to their basics: autonomy, flexibility, student-centeredness. And as your wonderful study just demonstrated, it worked. Yes, we've experienced tremendous and traumatic learning loss, and that is but one of the traumas. In some of our schools in Los Angeles, a full 1 out of 3 students have lost a caregiver to COVID. So no, this is not something we bounce back from. very easily. Food insecurity, housing instability, the deep divides of digital inequity, and all the things that have been part of the package of this collective trauma that COVID has been. I'm still incredibly proud that our schools used that standing in community to lean in harder, to understand that they are ever more proximate to the folks who need us the most, and use those public institutions as places of healing and of belonging. And going back to where I started, if the search for me personally was to create these spaces of belonging and success, then I think I'm at the right spot.
Wonderful. Thank you. Romy, what have you learned? How do you view the landscape? What's working? What's not?
So first I want to say what a privilege it is to be in this room with all of you and on the stage with these three amazing women. One of the things that the Walton family is deeply passionate about is the idea of intergenerational change. And I just feel incredibly excited to be with all three of you, women who have paved the way for leaders like me. So I want to say thank you. And my story, as Mackie said, starts in New York City, as many of yours do as well. And my passion in this work, and sort of the thread that I think about that connects all of my experiences, is culture change. And the ways in which culture change, changing norms, changing expectations, and changing narratives, ultimately leads to different outcomes, and in particular, different outcomes for those who are most vulnerable. When I joined the New York City Department of Education, I was a worker bee, and I had my sleeves rolled up and was ready to jump into what was, at the time, as everybody knows, this enormous experiment to transform the New York City public school system after decades of stagnant results. And what I saw happening around me in this massive organization, this massive bureaucracy, was little by little culture change. And it's pretty hard to describe the how. It was a combination of strategies and tactics and individual leaders with vision, kind of just making things happen. But as a young person in the work, I just kind of had my eyes wide open and saw what happens when you have a fierce belief that something is possible and you are willing to take risks to achieve it. And so I am eminently grateful for the experience of being able to work under Mayor Bloomberg, Joel Klein, the many talented cabinet members that they were able to bring into the work, and all of the incredible school leaders who joined the ranks of New York City during that time, both in traditional district schools and in the charter sector, who ultimately were the change agents, because really where the culture change was happening was inside of schools and inside of classrooms. Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, that is something that I have taken with me, where I kind of watched as we were changing things inside of schools, thinking, how can we do this in a more holistic way in partnership with communities? How can we change the dialogue? How can we change the narrative? And what we saw as we were phasing out low-performing schools and opening new schools that were ultimately, as Mackie's research has shown, higher performing for students, that there was just so much misunderstanding and so much misinformation out there. And I got really galvanized about the idea of elevating fact-based information as well as diverse perspectives into the conversation about educational change in a different way. And so I embarked on an experiment that I truly didn't know what the outcome of it was gonna be, called the 74, and let's see, 6-7 years later now, it is reaching tens of millions of people, and I think, making a mark in the national dialogue about our work, and directing forces in different ways, and I'm really proud of that. I think there were a lot of hidden truths that the media at the time, when we were getting started at around 2014, was just sort of blatantly ignoring. There was a dominant narrative in the mainstream papers, news sites, about what was wrong with the system and who was to blame. And nobody was centering communities and nobody was centering students. And I'm sure if someone commissioned a study of all of the news articles from that time and from this era of district reform, so few of them would have the actual voice of a parent or a student incorporated. It was always, here's what the district is saying and here's what the union is saying, and that was the storyline. And yet all of us in this room know that it's so much more nuanced and complex than that. So we set out to solve that and tell a different story. And doing that work was, incredible for so many reasons, but for me, also just gave me a national perspective and introduction to so many perspectives that I think were kind of coming together in interesting ways to make change. When I decided to leave, what I was motivated by in joining the Walton Family Foundation after having been a partner and a grantee was the Waltons' commitment to collaborating differently and using collaboration as a force for culture change. Working across lines of difference, working across generations, working across all different kinds of divides that, we know are tearing people apart more than ever before in this moment. But this commitment in the long run to bringing people together around shared values, not necessarily shared ideas, not necessarily shared solutions, but shared values, was to me a very inspiring way to think about the role of philanthropy in supporting culture change. And in the last 3 years, with a lot of support around me, we are starting to think about how philanthropy can operate differently. How can we be more nimble? How can we let communities lead in different ways? How can we set up mechanisms to support innovation that can actually be scaled and lead to breakthrough results? So fundamentally, while our day-to-day business is the work of grant making and getting to support an incredible portfolio of entrepreneurs who are breaking all the rules and making an incredible difference in the lives of children, the big idea is culture change. And I think that when I think about the direction that we all need to be heading in this moment, coming out of the pandemic, given how great the need is in communities, we have to be thinking about a new way of collaborating, a new way of coming together, and working across lines of difference. And I'll just say one more thing, which is that there is a generational shift going on, and maybe we can talk about this a little bit later in the conversation, but more than ever before, I believe that collaboration has to involve youth. We have to be thinking about co-designing with youth and making them part of the conversation and not just the end users.
Thank you. Sure. Russlynn, you're up.
For which one? The circuitous route of how we got here?
The circuitous route of how you got here, but specifically how that helps you think about the challenges as you view the landscape today.
Thank you. It's a super thoughtful question. So there were two professional experiences that we didn't talk about on the bio that I think had actually three great impact in getting here now. The first was a teacher between college and law school. And at the time, I probably didn't realize the long-term impact it would have on all of my life choices. Both the firsthand experience of the power of what an adult in a caring and trusting relationship can do to change a person's life. I also had done deep civil rights work with Marian Wright Edelman as a liaison to her early in my career, and had the opportunity at the start of the Broad Foundation to be an assistant director there when there were 3 people working there, and Eli loaned me out for 80% of my time to be the chief of staff at LAUSD, which became the first Broad resident of what is now a prolific program. So that intersection of policy, of advocacy, of law, and the Constitution, and witnessing both in my own experience, not unlike so many of us, the power of education to achieve upward mobility in this country. The through line always being data by the stalwarts in this room. I mean, it was Rick Hanishek who first helped me understand that what I had experienced in my own upbringing, that the lack of readiness that I certainly felt going into Spelman College, no less American University, or even law school, or practicing law. I mean, coming out of law school with a ton of debt and practicing, white-collar criminal defense and securities fraud litigation at a big law firm. The lack of readiness, despite having achieved all the credentials, that had happened through the course of a system that had made a ton of empty promises for myself and my immigrant family. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, recognizing and witnessing again that, but without that education, the promise of all of the success that this superpower and that America had to offer could not be delivered. It was Andres, we learned so much today again, but that I first learned that it didn't have to be this way, that we had evidence that poverty wasn't destiny. Mm-hmm. That if we could continue to drive data to encourage a civic and political will, we could see change occur. And so that through line that we're witnessing today, that I experienced, at the start of my career, that needing data-rich evidence of how to solve the problems we heard Reed today tell us you have to sell hope, right? Incorporating it in, showing what is possible, not resting in the solutions, not resting in the problems, but getting right to the solutions is really what took me into the world of an Ed Trust. Mm-hmm. Having witnessed at the Broad Foundation, seeing unlikely allies coming together to do civil rights. This is at the time that Roy Romer was coming in to LAUSD. The idea of accountability was in disaggregating data was something that we were all learning. Mike Cohen was pushing us to remember what Goals 2000 was, and that we could truly get clear benchmarks for what all kids needed to know and be able to do at every grade level, and build systems of supports around that. And so then it was infighting, right? So then it just got, if we have the know-how, if we have the evidence, we have increasing bodies of data to show us how to do this. If change of the magnitude really does require deep cultural shift, change anywhere has to involve the most organic stakeholders in the movement. And so empowering people to dream smart about what their schools could be, and using the best and catalyzing the most innovative science across brain science, across best practices, across all that works, empowering people with that information and catalyzing change when those dreams manifest became, I got lucky enough to be able to do it in lots of different incarnations. And that's what we're doing at Emerson, and that's what XQ is all about.
Thank you. That's a beautiful segue into my next question. And this is, it's another personal question, but I think it has immediate application to the challenges that we've been talking about all day. It's one thing to think about policy and to think about the political landscape and to articulate forces and shifts and challenges and barriers. It's another thing to sit in the trenches and lead year after year after year after year. That is a very different enterprise. It takes a different set of skills. It takes a different mindset. It takes a different set of resources. And so my question to each of you, and we can do this in any order you'd like, is what are the critical ingredients that you think you need? If you were to write the recipe for leadership of a change organization, what would that recipe look like? You can tell I like cooking. But what would the recipe look like? And what are the critical pieces that have to be in place? They may not be the same year over year over year, but what are the critical pieces? And how do you make sure that you get those? So you've been in Walton for 3 years now. You know what the resources are. You know what leadership looks like. How about we start with you?
For me, I mean, we've named a lot of ingredients in this cake, we'll call it. Data, culture, narrative, sheer force of will. I think that risk-taking, particularly in the context of the work that we do at the Walton Family Foundation, is a critical part of leadership. There are a lot of forces at play that make us all want to play it safe. And we do know a lot about what works. And also, there are millions and millions and millions of students out there who are still not well served by those solutions. So what comes to mind for me is risk-taking, being willing to invest in the unknowns. For us, that's innovations inside of the system and outside of it. It's charter schools, and it's also new models like learning pods and micro schools and hybrid models and new models that maybe people in this room are conjuring as we speak. But I do think that as we think about continuing to try to scale our work, we have to be willing to take risks. And that risk-taking also has to translate, and Russlynn said this really eloquently, in the way that we let communities lead, which means giving up power, which means setting up a different dynamic from the onset in how we work with partners, and also setting expectations that are less about what we think is right and are about partners coming to us with solutions that they think are right. So I'll pause there. I want to hear what you guys think.
Ladies?
I'll sign on to all of that and also add that we've been talking today about solutions and challenges and problems at various levels of scale and scope. But I want to remind us also that we're living in a very fraught political environment as well. That is very raw, and it's very potent, and it can easily just bowl you over if you're not ready for the rawness of it. And so part of the risk-taking for me as a leader of charter schools in California in this moment also means, finding unusual allies and breaking away from, our traditional lane and trying to find a different form of collaboration when the stage is still set for open confrontation in the rawest of political ways. It means having the sort of stamina and long view of the game to figure out how to find common cause with rural schools, small LEAs. We've made overtures and tried to work with the civil rights community with varying degrees of success or lack thereof, but also thinking about the early education sector, businesses. There are whole sectors of the state that are just about ready to develop in completely different ways, even as California's urban core is essentially emptying out because of the economic pressures accelerated by the pandemic. We're dealing also with some real structural factors like the very rapid loss of enrollment, which are only going to actually make those political fights harder. So some of that is, some of what I know I need and that we try to infuse across our culture at CCSA and help our schools is we are also the ones who take the punch, right? So that leaders can lead and do the things that they need to do to serve their students well and better and deeper, and so that they can survive. Because there are many ways in which it is not hyperbole to say that the very existence of charter schools politically is very much at risk. So humility, knowing that we sometimes will lose some of the battles, having a commitment to continue to be curious and open-hearted and continue to engage in different ways with community. A lot of what we've been working on through as well is our old model of engaging in politics and how it needs to be more deeply connected to community. But also ultimately just being fearless. But wait, no, I'll amend that. There is no place where there is no fear. There is the place every moment, though, that we are called to move on anyway. And so there's a certain amount of sort of resiliency and thick-headedness and thick-skinnedness as well that is required and necessary so that we, the 750,000 students in our care and all those others who can and should be benefiting by what we know the evidence shows works and is actually, living out those experiences in our schools that can be something that is offered for everyone. It's not good enough to say that it's an end of itself or that charters are an end game, not that anybody ever did, but that challenge of continuing to push through and doubling down on innovation, perhaps, with a greater sense of humility, but also, staying steady to the understanding that what we do is ultimately very political and that we need to have the courage to continue the course. That's all necessary.
That's really beautiful. I agree with all of that. The only two I'd add, empathy, really leading with it. And not just in how we show up in the world and how we present ourselves in this work, but really for the people beside us, for our teams, especially now when everybody and everything is so fragile. And visioning. So much of what we are talking about is science fiction. These schools don't exist, right? We have the know-how, but we have very few system-wide models that have gotten it right, especially now with these new demands and in light of the learning loss. So being able to paint a portrait of what is possible, what is achievable, to show both our teams and the nation that this can be done has been a constant push, certainly something I strive to always be able to do as a leader.
So out of that leadership, not only do you have to have all of the innate characteristics of a leader to show up every day, but you also have to have the keenness of vision and strategy, and you have to have the skills to execute to a really high standard. And part of that execution, I think, is in identifying the sort of untapped areas that you haven't really mined well in order to build capacity either within your organization or around your organization as the network of support. And so if I ask you, where haven't you yet courageously gone to build connection, what would your answer be?
I go everywhere.
What?
I go everywhere.
You'd go.
I think it's also to Romy's point at the start when she reminded of us of our age.
That's not what I did.
I think you should speak for yourself.
But right, the only the education has been full of fits and starts, and the only sustained progress that we've seen is when we come together across unlikely allies. And whether that's historically in a community that is rightfully afraid of what is being done to them and what has been done to them, or a community that has been listening to a lot of hogwash, right? Depending on where you sit, both things are true. Or a community that otherwise doesn't care about the equity-focused nature of why I do what I do. We touch schools twice in our lifetimes, right? It's the most intimate, one of the biggest public program on the planet, and a thing that is most intimate because it's us and our kids, and it shapes our lives, and it is full of emotion as a result. But if we can't come together across those differences, nothing gets done and kids lose. And every time we go backwards, I feel like the longer I stay in this, trying to be a soldier in this movement, every time we watch those data go backwards, I can point to big adults fighting that mucked up what was really great progress, whether it is a random reading program with Republicans or whether it is meaningful and broad-based accountability on the other side.
Input from the two of you?
I don't know the answer, Maggie. I'll tell you, I've never resisted going somewhere. I think this is a moment where that question must be asked consistently. You know, I know the question has been asked. You know, whether a direct collaboration and partnership with the teacher unions would change the dynamics for us in the Capitol, for example. I've gone there. It's hard. I won't say no, but I'm saying it's challenging, especially given the structural challenges that we have right now, especially around funding and declining enrollment. Those forces make it very difficult. It's not lack of will, it's interest. So, but we're open. You know, I know that we have to continue to reinvent ourselves and meet the moment, as our governor loves to say, and he's so accurate in that specific, you know, opportunity, or like how do you identify the opportunity as well as the threat, and also challenge yourself to think about a problem differently. I think that the challenges of growth, for example, of the charter movement over the past 10, 15 years are very different than the problems of today, and we have to absolutely be very adaptable to it. For example, we still rightfully are very concerned about outcomes. We've been talking about outcomes and the gaps and all of that. But I think there is a new appetite, and well overdue, from our leaders to also engage on issues like digital inequities, around infrastructure, around the very deep and very immediate ways in which they were called to act in the pandemic by becoming food distribution centers, dealing with intervening directly in homelessness. And I think there's an inclination to say, well, that's off your lane and you're not going to fix everything. But the moment is different, and I think it laid bare sort of the interdependence of these structural issues. And yet we can't afford to say, well, we're not going to look at testing data or rigor or learning loss because, you know, there are these more immediate survival issues. But to the extent that we are responsive to them and are able to show up in meaningful and direct ways, that's the way we can gain better collaboration. I do believe it has the potential to even reorganize our political relationships in the Capitol, and should drive us to think about our own place in the array of solutions that America needs in this moment to hold us together. Because I do believe that education must and continue to be a meeting place for those of us with varying ideas. You put it so well, Romy. I'm going to butcher what you said, but you said we can share values and still have different ideas around implementation and tactics. And I think that what is being played out in boardrooms, in school district boardrooms, in charter school boardrooms right now, a lot of the fights that we know are not ultimately going to lead to better access. They are so loud and so pervasive and so distracting. And they do threaten to break us apart. And we have a duty, a moral duty, to hold center.
I'll just add a quick note building on both of the points. Myrna said, you know, basically we need to go and be willing to talk to people we disagree with. And I just want to shout out Pedro and Rick, I don't know if they're here, for their kind of public disagreement and modeling what that can look like and how we can have civil discourse and bring different ideas to the table. Nobody likes to talk to people they disagree with unless you're one of those people that just loves getting into it on Twitter. But we've got to do it. I think we're all going to be better for it. And building on Russlynn's point, I agree. Like literally, we have to go everywhere. But when I think about everywhere, I think about all of the communities that frankly have not been the focus of national education reform for the past 2 decades. So by and large, those of us who have been working nationally have been focused on the same dozen or so places where there's been incredible growth, where there's been a lot of philanthropy, where we have gotten important policies passed and changed the environment for change. And also, there's a lot more communities out there that are ready to go. We are in conversations with places like Jacksonville, Florida, and Salt Lake City, and Jackson, Mississippi. And I think we all need to be in our work thinking about how we grow the number of communities where even elements of these strategies can be possible, because I do think going everywhere is a reasonable goal, even though it sounds a little unreasonable.
Well, I think we're talking about different things. The going everywhere meaning the allies everywhere, right? Finding allies across the political spectrum is the question that I was answering. So
Yeah.
whether you're right, left, or in between, right? I'm willing to go listen, learn, and teach.
Yeah, and I think it's that and literally going everywhere.
Yeah.
So one of the things I'm hearing here is the idea of building coalition and building a big tent. I want to just pause for a moment and say much of what I've seen in the political sphere, perhaps not in the state legislatures, although I think it plays out there, but literally the panic across districts about declining enrollments as a result of the pandemic. I think it's a little bit of a mask, because if you look actually at most districts, those enrollments were declining anyway beforehand. This just blew it up. And so you've got this emerging crisis in districts, right? Whether they're willing to give voice to it or not, the number of districts that are facing a fiscal cliff, ESSER funds to the side, a fiscal cliff that cannot be sustained for 10 years. What I have not seen yet is the creative understanding of what that means to secure support, perhaps not at the union level, right? But perhaps there's an opportunity to build in to school leaders and to teachers and to area coordinators for particular subject matters, the kinds of bridges and mutual support that would be the same as meeting food issues and addressing housing insecurity. That there are these other places within our own system that we're not going as change agents. And these are folks who are sitting in their seats saying, a tidal wave, a tsunami is coming at me. I don't have a solution. So I'm thinking about this also as the big tent of bringing in lots of other stakeholders that haven't been activated, who are our natural allies outside of the school system, as you've been talking about, but also how do we think about mobilizing in this moment, as you say, how do we mobilize into the existing delivery system to help them understand that there is a solution that's available, and it's going to serve them as much as they're being served now, if not better. So what's your thought about that?
I think there's some potential there. I mean, certainly when the pandemic first hit, we actually did do a lot of regional networking and support activities with especially with the Small School Districts Association, with rural schools. We use some of our best blended learning schools to actually just do sort of open source their professional development and help districts and practitioners, actually even internationally, adapt to that new modality of learning remotely. You know, two and a half years in, we're beginning to reap those dividends, actually. There's a new openness, actually, that some of these traditional education sector, but not the teachers union per se, actors are curious about what we do and how we do it, and willing to step into collaboration and partnership with us at the school level, at the regional level, and at the organizational institutional level. So that's definitely something that we're looking forward to mining even further. The challenge becomes, how does that translate either into policy or structures that might disseminate that more broadly, and then power comes in and it makes things fall apart. But I am encouraged that those kinds of sort of tactical collaborations did and are occurring as a survival mechanism, and I would love to continue to do those more, because I think that's the worst thing we could do right now is waste the opportunity to use what we've learned about how disrupting time and place and delivery vehicle and platform can do to accelerate and learning and creative staffing. Those are all things that our schools did to lean in deeper and to make sure that our students were also supported, not just academically, but also in their social and emotional needs. Like I said, the trauma was really deep in some of our most impacted communities, and schools just had to reinvent how they were going to spend their time together, and by whom would the students be supported. I'm actually very encouraged that we're looking at things much more holistically now.
Mm-hmm. I think that the best systems, whether that's a school or a district, they are porous. Community partnerships are integral in how they get their work done. That philosophy, coupled with $190 billion for the first time in history that is coming as a result of COVID relief monies, should foster and allow for these new kinds of relationships to solve common goals. And if schools are redesigned and reborn to be the hub of community, it necessitates those other disciplines and places in neighborhoods to be a part of schools.
I don't want to sound the devil's advocate. I'm just going to draw in a conversation from earlier today, which is that the real risk of all of that money and all of the time post-COVID is the retrenchment, right? And so it leads me to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is, how can we, as change makers, make sure that innovation is a central tenet of what we do without looking as though we are waving wildly and grasping at things because anything might look good. So I'm trying to make the statement that the only organizations that are going to bring innovation to public education are not the entrenched public school system, right? And I would even say that, sorry to say, among magnet schools that are supposed to be creative and innovative, among charter schools that are supposed to be innovative and creative, that they get to a point where they move to the safe zone too. So what do we do as change organizations, and I include my team as part of that, what do we do to continue to push that the only way through this is to bring new models, to prove new models, and to invite adoption and dissemination of new models? How do we do that? Romy, why don't you take a shot?
Sure. Well, a couple of thoughts come to mind. And maybe this is also a good segue to your conversation with Bernita after, who I think will have a better answer to this question than all of us, because, she is an incredible rapid prototyper. And that is what innovation was about for these last 2 years, and in a lot of ways will be about for these next 10. I think we have to have an ethos in our organizations, whether they're micro schools or the Walton Family Foundation or Credo, that rapid prototyping and continuing to revisit our assumptions based on feedback that we're getting, data that we're getting, demand information that we're getting, that has to be part of how we operate. I also think that, somewhere in the last question and this question is a question about how we are activating communities around lighthouses and sort of thinking about widespread adoption of new models. And I think we have to get more strategic about who the audience is when we're doing storytelling and sharing information. I think XQ has done groundbreaking work in that way, in thinking about how to tell a different story and reach a different audience and excite a different constituency. I think we know that most people are reading and obtaining information on their phone, probably inside of a social media app. And so when we think about widespread adoption of innovative models, we have to also be thinking about how are we going to make what those models are about shareable on a phone inside of a social media app, which probably means that a lot of us don't have the right expertise in our organization currently and need to build towards that. It's just hard, and that landscape is changing a lot. So I don't know if I'm directly answering your question. I think it's both sort of thinking about what's going to allow for innovation at scale, and then what is it about organizations that can propel that forward, and there's something similar in both answers.
I think there's more of a, I totally agree with that, and I think there's actually more of a hunger for change now than there's ever been. I don't think it's just I heard the secretary talk about the whiff of change, that you can feel it, right? The demand from parents, from young people themselves, from teachers for change has, in my experience, never been greater and never been so consistent across. Now, there's not common direction yet, right, on what exact change, but for change, it feels more present than ever before. And I think what comes with that, by definition, is, and you taught me this back years ago, an authentic renewal of faith and hope in the American public education system to help us solve our own problems. Capitalizing on that now, right? Feeding it so that we don't regress to the mean as the fall starts feels ever more urgent.
I don't want to go after that beautiful closing statement there. But I will also say, it's also the question of need, right? And demand from parents, for sure. I can't tell you how often we get into arguments in the Capitol about, the original intent of charter schools was to spur competition, teacher-directed new models, and innovate. And by golly, you haven't innovated us enough. You haven't changed us, therefore that's the evidence that you don't work. There's a lot of innovation that has occurred, not just in the immediate context of charters, in the immediate context of districts. I would certainly posit that, for example, the question of whether Los Angeles is a city of choice goes well beyond just how many charters are authorized by LAUSD, but in fact there are more magnets that are not competitive, right, that function very much like charters, then there are charter schools in Los Angeles, right? And that's almost a settled question, no one size fits all, and yet we still see these massive gaps in achievement that are, very well tracked to what zip code you live in.
So I want to jump in on this and say, one of the things that my team, who's sitting out there somewhere, has been able to demonstrate is that kids coming back from the pandemic are coming back with a wider variation in their academic readiness than ever before. And that incredible variation does not match up to any, I'm going to underscore, any of the school models that we have today, where kids go to school and they receive some kind of instructional model. And so my interest in carving out the culture of innovation, experimentation, and learning is very much focused on a recognition that we are unlikely to be able to meet the needs of all students with the schools that we have today. And so helping carry the banner that we need sanctioned and supported experimentation. I don't mean it like a laboratory science,
You're
but
right.
I mean moving in partnership with community, listening and bringing both expertise and local level grassroots activism together to build new approaches to educating our youth is something that frankly is not in the interests of the established district public school structure. And yet there are these change organizations around who I think could be the vehicle for that. And my question is, how do we do that?
Can I just put a positive spin on what you just said? It's a very important point. But it's not just pandemic learning loss. It's also the fact that we don't have the right assessments today to measure children's unique gifts, right? So it's absolutely necessary and feels so urgent in this moment. I mean, we all read the piece in the Times this week about kindergartners not being able to read, and every story like that and every experience we all have walking into a school grappling with a new data set. It's hard not to have a heavy heart. And also, when I think about the future of learning and the future of assessment, there is also the need to think about the gifts that every child has. So I think we need to solve it, but for both reasons.
But you bring up a really important point on assessment writ large. So the one thing that we can't let happen is zero accountability. And that is what we got right now. So if we don't even have the evidence, if we're going to stop having college admissions has always been the anchor that would drive what was happening. I mean, the fulcrum of high school is because it would impact everything above and below, right? So if we are no longer, we run the risk of if exit criteria and entrance criteria are so, if we're not even having the conversation anymore about the alignment between those, the whole system falls apart. And if we don't use assessments as the weight, both carrot and stick, but as the weight, as the temperature, if nothing else, of what is happening, this is what keeps me right now up the most at night for your midnight calls. You can call me up and figure out what the hell are we
So
going
glad Zoom
to
has
do.
the group function. We're all going to be on there.
Right?
Yeah.
But what to do? What are we going to do about assessments? And what is this movement and the leadership of stalwarts in this room and in data-rich wonks that need to force a federal government and local constituencies not to give up, and testing companies and curriculum companies not to give up on actually assessing young people and making those data publicly transparent.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, I think that's a great place to start to transition to some of our Q&A. Could I have our microphone people help too? And if anybody has a question, feel free to raise their hand. Oh, there. Right there on the aisle, we have the first question. And then we have a second question over here. And third question over there. Aisling, okay.
Is there a role for political leadership in any of this? I noticed that at state level and at city level, in certain states, not all states, education's become the third rail. Now, we have tons of third rails in public policy discourse. We can't talk about entitlement programs, et cetera, but education seems to have entered into that realm too. And so how can you change the political environment so that they become to help, they're there to help you?
Well, I'm not sure we can change the political environment, but I think one question is, can we change politicians? And when I think about the biggest leverage point to do that, it is at the state level. And it's why the work that Secretary Rice and the Hoover Institution do is so important, because they have the ability to convene governors, to help with agenda setting and vision setting, to not just come in and say, okay, like, you've got some ideas and we can try to help you work at them, but to be partners at the table from the beginning. I think Patricia and Excel and Ed do this really well too. with people at all levels of government. They want to provide the kind of technical assistance that isn't just about implementation challenges, but is about vision setting, and it starts early. So when I think about where we can try to support that, it's there.
Great. Christina?
So because I like counting my money and other people's too, sometimes I've stayed up and did the ESSER fund tracker for nights and wanted to know what was the $190 billion going to be spent on, and noticed that there were places that didn't even apply for one or two, but yet they're complaining about losing parents and students and can't find them. And you know, just thinking when I was looking through that over the spirit and intent behind Title I and the ability it has to carve out that parent engagement, but it's often overlooked. And the parents that need the funding the most and that need the up to 2% of total funding allocated for parent and family engagement weren't even sought out in those plans. And I didn't see any robust changes in ESSER funding requests either, or the plans for parent and family engagement. And so I think that the risk is bigger than what people think, of going backwards instead of forwards. And I want to know, like, how to move beyond just that box checking. Like, we work on this in organizations, but with the parents that are dependent on local schools or LEAs, SEAs the most, it's not something that they intentionally calculate. They're not going to stay up, you know, reading ESSER fund trackers. You know, some of them will, maybe many won't. But giving the money back to the same people that did not really care to carve out that 2% or up to 2% is dangerous. And it's not going to benefit the people that should be sought out and protected under the spirit and intent in Title I. I know that the monies were allocated from Congress for Title I Part A, yet they weren't exclusionary for appropriations according to Title I Part A. But it's still that thought about the parent and family engagement. So where do you guys see that future-wise, the trajectory of that? For parents and families to really be taken seriously.
I mean, you raised a hugely important issue that spans not just in how money is distributed, but how schools are open to the families that matter the most, right? And so it is a school culture issue as much as it is a policy issue. The CARES Act required a level of parental and stakeholder involvement that I've never seen in a piece of federal policy. And it lists them out, like the guidance from the feds will, you know, sort of list out every type of person and individual and that you should bring in to talk to about how to spend these monies. So in so doing, it tried to get at that Title I parent provision spirit, right? This notion that in order to get this money, I'm holding as a contingency and a condition of these funds that you, institution, will open the door and listen to and bring in parents. In the same way that some places did it right with Title I through the years, and some places did it horrible. I mean, I know that you've also heard those stories of the professional parents that wouldn't show up, and no one knew where those stipends were going, and just horror story after horror story. So we need policies that will require, that do say you actually have to listen to your community and bring them in, and we need organizations that will help translate some of this more arcane policy into information that is palpable and communities can understand and then act on. But at the end of the day, if the adults in the building aren't opening the doors to sit and be partners with parents and rid of the antagonism that prevents change, we get stuck in constant finger pointing.
And I just want to celebrate all the work that the National Parents Union is doing on this front. I mean, and so many organizations who are providing accountability platforms for all the federal dollars. And not only that, but actually working with parents to help educate them so that they can be a force for change. So thank you.
I would also argue that this is requiring compliance with this at this point is probably going to be resisted by 90% of the folks who have to do it. But what I think ends up happening is that once you've gone through it once, you realize it's not quite so bad. And so maybe the next time it's not 90%, maybe it's 70%. And so I have to say, while I'm not a fan of regulation, where I really do like a lot more flexibility, where you're trying to affect a culture change in the way that we need to have happen in the country today, I'm not averse to using the dollars to create conditions that need to be met. This was not unlike Race to the Top, where you had your prerequisites in order to be able to apply for funds. And this is a place where I think we can actually have a constructive use of public dollars to actually try to drive culture change into organizations. Other questions? I saw some other hands.
But also showing their, how to do it right. You know how. Most people don't, right? Most schools, both families and schools, the level of interaction, it's if you don't know how to do that in a healthy, action-oriented way, right? You end up being antagonistic and rabble-rousy without intending. So spreading those models, getting you out there everywhere to show how to do it and to empower people with the ability to do it for themselves is key.
Top down, bottom up. Another one.
Bottom up.
Aisling, please.
Hi. I have a question about how to harness and build upon the energy and enthusiasm for real change and reform that we've seen throughout the pandemic. So a lot of people talk about the pandemic as really being an inflection point in education and really waking people up and galvanizing parents to really take control and become more involved in their child's education. And so my question is, coming out of the pandemic, I can see how it would be really easy for us to forget about all the interest we had in making things better. So what can we do to ensure that the energy that families and other folks had about change, how can we make sure that that lasts? And how can we build upon that to actually create real change?
I mean, it's the hundreds and hundreds of millions and billions dollar question. I think, one view of it is the pandemic got people to express a sense of discontent and a set of opinions that I would argue, were maybe holding inside for a long time. That people were dissatisfied before the pandemic. People were frustrated with the systemic inequities before the pandemic. They liked their teacher, but they also kind of knew that their school wasn't as good as it should be. So I take the view that now that all of this has come to the surface, it's not going anywhere. Now, that might sound a little Pollyanna-ish. I think we need to do, work in partnership with communities to elevate both the success stories and the horror stories, and there will be many as it pertains to how some of these federal dollars are directed. And we just need to stay focused on what we've kind of been talking about for this whole panel discussion, which is community-driven change. I think if we find ways to let parents drive and be a force for change and set the agendas, then my hope would be that all of that energy could get put to good use. But I do think it's going to require, as we've also said, new ways of collaborating, new partnerships, cross-sector partnerships, and thinking about thriving youth in a much more dynamic way than maybe we did before COVID.
So I'm going to grab the microphone and have the last word. And it's actually to throw a rose to Russlynn as part of the XQ work. And I will have to confess, at the time I thought it was complete Looney Tunes. She developed a training program to encourage people to prepare to run for school boards. I'm sure that she had much more foresight than I did at the time that we would have a global pandemic and that we would be harnessing a vast amount of dissatisfaction. But what I would say is that that kind of anticipatory capacity building has the opportunity to really pay off now as school boards become an extremely important focal point for how resources are allocated, how communities are listened to, how power is shared. We have, across the country, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people who are ready to step up and say, if you don't do it, I will. And so I'd like to thank you for your foresightedness and giving me a learning moment. And with that, I would like to thank our speakers and ask you to join me in that.